Hello everybody, welcome to Nursery Production and Management. Today's topic is weed management, and this presentation is only a brief introduction to weed management in nurseries. First of all, let's define what we mean by a weed. A weed is a plant that is growing in a place where it is not wanted. So if you have another plant growing in a container that contains your ornamental plant, that plant is probably going to be a weed. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, is a system for managing pest problems, including weeds, that includes a variety of different tactics. In integrated pest management, managing weed problems begins with low-risk tactics like sanitation and may include higher-risk tactics like herbicide applications. What are some of the characteristics of weeds that make them so difficult to control? Let's look at a couple. Number one, weeds are prolific seed producers. Successful weed species produce a lot of small seed. They may also spread by structures such as rhizomes and/or stolons. Number two, seed dormancy. Many weed seeds can stay dormant in the soil for long periods of time, germinating only when conditions for germination are optimal. Number three, seed scattering mechanisms. Seeds may be wind or water dispersed, and they may stick to people and animals. Have you ever gone for a walk and then discovered on your pant leg small burrs from a plant? Well, as you walk around, you're dispersing those seeds from one location to another. Number four, perennial life cycle. Many successful weed species, but not all, are perennial and survive for many years. Number five, brittle stems. When you try to pull weeds that have brittle stems out of the ground, the stems just break off and the weeds end up resprouting later. Number six, fast growers. So many weed species are fast growers and outcompete the crop plants for water and nutrients. And number seven, herbicide resistance. Many weed species have developed herbicide resistance over time, which makes them very difficult to eradicate. We can classify weeds according to their growth habit, that is, whether they're broadleaf or grassy weeds, or we can classify them according to their life cycle, whether they're annual, biennial, or perennial. Broadleaf weeds would include prostrate or spotted spurge, common chickweed, bittercress, or common yellow wood sorrel. An example of a grassy weed would be crabgrass. Sedges are grass-like flowering plants with stems that are triangular in cross-section and leaves that are spirally arranged in three ranks. Sedges thrive in wet, poorly drained soil. An example of a sedge is yellow nutsedge. Annual, biennial, and perennial are terms that describe the weed's life cycle. Knowing the weed's life cycle will help you select the right herbicide. For example, annuals are generally controlled well with pre-emergence herbicides. Biennials are going to be controlled using a combination of both pre- and post-emergence herbicides, and perennials often require multiple tactics to achieve control, including the use of pre- and post-emergence herbicides. The cost of weeds in production. So weeds steal water and nutrients from crop plants. weeds reduce the overall marketability of container and field-grown products. And they've estimated that in container nurseries, the cost for weed management can be as high as $4,000 per acre, and that includes labor costs and herbicide and mulch expenses as well. Some research has shown that even a single weed in the restricted root environment found in a container can significantly affect the growth and size of the ornamental plant growing in that container. This slide and the following 5 slides show images of some of the more problematic weed species found both in the container and field production of ornamental nursery stock. This picture shows prostrate surge, which is a summer annual broadleaf weed that spreads by seed. Spurge is low growing. The leaves are oval in shape, small, and opposite along the stem. There is usually a red spot in the center of each leaf. Other distinct characteristics is the stem contains a milky sap that oozes when the stem is broken. Voted the #1 weed problem in container nursery production. Common chickweed. This species is an annual plant in colder climates, becoming evergreen and perennial in warmer climates. It has slender, weak stems that are sparsely hairy. The leaves are oval and opposite. The lower ones have leaf stalks or petioles. Bittercress is a winter annual or biennial plant in the mustard family, native to Europe and Asia, but also present in North America. It is commonly found in damp or disturbed soil. It has a basal rosette that may form a dense mat. The bright green leaves generally contain 4 to 8 leaflets arranged alternately along the rachis. The stems of the plant are hairless and the leaves remain green even through the winter months. Common yellow wood sorrel is a perennial species spreading by rhizomes and stolons as well as by seeds. Seeds have no dormancy and may germinate very quickly. The flowers are bright yellow. Other identifying characteristics include heart-shaped leaflets on trifoliate leaves, basically giving the leaves a cloverleaf resemblance. Crabgrass is a weedy summer annual that can spread quickly and form colonies. It develops several branching stems at the base with lower branches tending to sprawl across the ground, while their upper branches are more erect. It prefers full sun to partial sun and is very adaptable to poor soils. It has spread to nearly every state in the country. Nutsedge is a perennial that spreads predominantly by rhizomes and tubers, although viable seed can be produced. Plants die back to the ground in the fall, with new shoots emerging in the spring from underground tubers. This species, as well as other sedges, grows best in wet sites, prefers warm weather and full sun conditions, but will grow in a diversity of sites and environments. All right, that was a look at some of the common weed species that we find in North Texas, both in the field production and container production of ornamental nursery crops. Let's take a closer look at integrated pest management as it relates to weed control in nurseries. This slide summarizes the IPM tactics used in weed control. At the top of the slide are found simple, inexpensive tactics that can be employed to manage weeds. As you work down through the other tactics, cultural, mechanical, barriers, the cost per acre begins to increase. The herbicide tactic, found at the bottom of the slide, represents a more expensive weed control option. It is also the riskiest tactic in that there are inherent risks to the plants through potential herbicide injury, to the applicator, and potentially the environment. Let's begin by looking at sanitation tactics. Stepping onto a disinfectant mat is an example of a sanitation IPM tactic. This type of disinfectant is used to kill pathogens on the shoes of employees before they enter production areas to work. An enclosed media storage area keeps potting media dry and helps prevent contamination from weed seeds. This slide shows an example of not so great media storage. Here the media is stored in the open where it can get wet and weed seeds could potentially land on the surface of the medium, contaminating the medium. Since weed seeds are small and easily dispersed or spread around, keeping non-crop areas such as roads, walkways, and the areas surrounding water sources clean and weed-free is a way to reduce weed pressure and a necessary first step in eliminating weeds in production areas. Let's move on to cultural integrated pest management tactics. In container production, liverwort, which you see pictured in the slide, becomes highly competitive with the ornamental crop for water, nutrients, and space. Liverwort can form a mat that will prevent irrigation water and fertilizers from reaching the root zone of the ornamental crop and can actually repel water when dry. As a result, overall quality and market value decreases. Liverwort thrives in damp conditions. Avoid over-irrigating containers. Research has shown that drip or micro-irrigation can reduce the spread of liverwort when compared with overhead irrigation systems. If you have liverwort growing on the surface of your containers, you're probably watering too much. The two cultural IPM tactics for weed control in containers are water management and fertilization techniques. We just briefly discussed how water management can help control liverwort and potentially other weed problems in containers. The illustration in this slide shows the three most common methods for applying fertilizers to plants growing in containers. In the illustration, the blue dots represent granules of a controlled release fertilizer. In the diagram to the left, the fertilizer has been top dressed onto the surface of the growing medium. In the middle picture, the controlled release fertilizer has been incorporated into the growing medium, and this involves mixing the fertilizer into the medium prior to potting. In the diagram on the right, fertilizers have been dibbled into the medium. Dibbling fertilizers involves placing the entire allotment of fertilizer directly beneath the root ball of the liner that's to be placed in the container. This process is done while potting up the containers. Some research has shown that how fertilizers are applied can affect the number and dry weight of weeds growing in the container. Results have shown that containers that were top-dressed had significantly more weeds growing in them when compared to containers that had fertilizer incorporated or dibbled. Results, however, did vary across different weed species, and more research needs to be undertaken to determine how effective fertilizer placement is in controlling weed growth. Mechanical integrated pest management tactics. Hand weeding is a mechanical IPM tactic that'll probably never go away. Let's go ahead and attempt to calculate how much it would cost to hand weed 1 acre of container nursery stock over the course of 1 year. So we're going to make an assumption. The average length of time to hand weed 1,000 square feet of container nursery stock is 1 hour. And the approximate wage for an employee pulling weeds is $10.50 per hour. The cost to hand weed 1 acre would be as follows. If it takes 1 hour to hand weed 1,000 square feet, and we know that there are 43,560 square feet in an acre, if we take that number and divide it by 1,000, that'll tell us how many hours are needed to hand weed 1 acre of container nursery stock. So that would be 43.56 hours times an hourly rate of $10.50. So that gives you a total of $457.38 to hand weed 1 acre of container nursery stock. But here's the catch. Hand weeding once is not going to give you permanent results because chances are you're going to have more weeds start to grow in those containers. So you are going to have to go back at an interval to repeat the hand weeding. So in our case study that we're doing here, let's say that we have to go back and hand weed every 4 weeks over the course of a year to get good control of the weeds. Then it would end up costing $5,945.94 to hand weed 1 acre of container nursery stock over the course of 1 year. As it turns out, frequent hand weeding can save money. Hand weeding works best when the weeds are removed before they can set seed. Some research has shown that when pots were hand weeded every 2 weeks, the cumulative amount of weeds removed was reduced by an average of 74% compared to when pots were weeded just before herbicides were reapplied at 8-week intervals. Also, hand weeding every 2 weeks reduced overall labor costs by an average of 36%. So the moral of the story is, if you're hand weeding, it is actually more effective and saves more money to do it on a regular basis every 2 to 4 weeks. Using barriers as integrated pest management weed control tactics. Weed management in container nurseries is highly dependent upon the use of pre-emergence herbicides. Yet there are sensitive crops, such as tropicals and hydrangeas, for which pre-emergence herbicide is not recommended. In these cases, growers have relied upon sanitation and hand weeding to control weeds. Some growers have begun to experiment with various organic mulches. Pine bark nuggets, wood chips, parboiled rice hulls, and other organic mulch materials can be placed on the container medium surface to prevent or reduce the germination of many weed species by excluding light, reducing the moisture level at the medium surface, and providing a physical barrier to seed germination. Typically, these mulch materials need to be applied at depths of at least 1 inch in order to be effective. Applying mulch is expensive, both in terms of the mulch itself and the labor required to apply it. Here are some keys to successful mulch application. One is to use equipment wherever possible, like you see this picture of the rice hull blower. So this is a machine that's going to save a lot of labor expense when it comes to applying parboiled rice hulls as a mulch on the surface of container medium. The other thing that's going to be key to the success in using mulches is to remember you're going to need to apply the mulches at a depth of 1 inch or more to get effective results. Discs or disc mulches have been made out of organic materials such as plant fibers or even human hair, or synthetic materials such as plastics, felted materials, and geotextiles. Although fairly effective in preventing weed seedling emergence, weeds can emerge from around the edges of the discs or through the slit necessary for fitting the disc around the stem of the nursery plant. Some of the lighter weight discs have been prone to being blown out of containers. So as you can see in the picture, these discs you can buy and you can place them around each plant in the container. So there is a considerable amount of labor in having to go to each pot, go to each container, and then put one of these discs around the plant. But as you can see in the picture, kind of in the center of the slide, that sometimes weeds will escape through that slit or from around the edge of the disc. So that brings us to herbicides, which will be the last integrated pest management tactic that we will discuss in this presentation. Let's begin with some herbicide terminology. Pre-emergence herbicides control weeds at the seed germination stage or as they are emerging from the soil. Post-emergence herbicides control existing or established weeds. Contact herbicides kill or injure only that part of the plant with which they come into contact. Annual weeds may be killed, but regrowth of perennial weeds from below ground parts usually occurs following application of a contact herbicide. Translocated herbicides are absorbed by the leaves or roots of plants and move within the plant. They are needed to kill underground parts of perennial weeds. Selective herbicides kill some plants but do little or no damage to others. Non-selective herbicides kill or injure almost all plants. A great example of a non-selective translocated herbicide would be Roundup. There is an enormous amount of information that a user or applicator would have to sift through in order to select the proper herbicide for a particular application. And rather than try to put all that information in a presentation, I decided perhaps a better approach would be to look at the steps that anybody should take before applying a herbicide. And the information that I'm using comes from an article entitled Controlling Weeds in Nursery and Landscape Plantings, which is out of Penn State University Extension. Step number one is to identify the weeds to be controlled and understand their life cycles. So weeds can have an annual, biennial, or perennial life cycle. Generally speaking, annual weeds are easily controlled using pre-emergence herbicides. Biennial weeds, such as wild carrot, require 2 growing seasons to complete their life cycle. In the first season, the seeds germinate and the plants develop an extensive root system and a dense cluster of leaves called rosettes. In the following year, they flower, produce seed, and die. Biennials can be controlled by pre-emergence herbicides at the seed germination stage, but post-emergence translocated herbicides are required after biennials become established. Perennial weeds will grow and produce seed year after year. As with biennials, perennial weeds can be controlled from seed by pre-emergence herbicides, but post-emergence translocated herbicides are required after perennials have become established. Step number 2, read the herbicide label and make sure the herbicide is safe to use on the desired ornamental plants. A herbicide called Gallery, for example, is safe to use over the top of many ornamentals, but for some unknown reason severely injures winged euonymus, which happens to be very sensitive. Step number 3, determine the proper application rate. The formulas for calculating the amount of herbicide needed for a particular area depend upon the formulation of the herbicide. The amount of active ingredient, or AI, in dry formulations of herbicide is presented as a percentage of active ingredient. The amount of active ingredient in liquid herbicide formulations is presented as pounds of active ingredient per gallon. Step number 4, calibrate the sprayer or spreader. This is important because, as an applicator, you need to know how much product your sprayer or spreader puts out per unit area. We won't get into the details of calibration in this presentation. There are many online resources that can help you perform this critical step. Step number 5, determine the area to be treated. Usually the treatment area will be measured in square feet. Step number 6, determine how much herbicide will be needed to cover the area at the application rate selected in step number 3. For granular and wettable, that is dry materials, dry herbicides, the following formula is the formula that you would use to calculate how much of the herbicide will be needed. So let's go ahead and kind of break this formula down. So pounds of active ingredient per acre, that's right here. Pounds of active ingredient per acre, that would be your rate. This part of the equation is simply going to convert square feet to acres. We know that there's 43,560 square feet in an acre. So if we measure an area that's going to be treated and our answer is in square feet, if we divide by 43,560 square feet per acre, we're going to end up with acres. So that's what that part of the formula is doing. It's converting square feet to acres. And then finally, this part of the formula over to the right, this is adjusting for the amount of active ingredient that the particular herbicide you're choosing to use has. So this is an important thing to wrap your head around, because when you buy a herbicide, it's never going to contain 100% active ingredient. It's going to contain a much, much smaller percentage of active ingredient, and the rest of the product in the container is just going to be inert. It's going to really have no value except for, spreading that herbicide around. So this part right here of the formula adjusts for the concentration of active ingredient. And then finally, your answer will be in pounds needed to treat the particular area that you measured. For liquid formulations, the formula is slightly different. It contains, for the most part, the same parts. You start with your rate over here, pounds of active ingredient per acre. The middle part of the formula is going to change square feet to acres. And then the third part of the formula over here is going to compensate for the fact that the liquid formulations don't contain 100% active ingredient. So the answer that you're going to get will be the gallons. Since we're dealing with liquid formulations, your answer is going to be the gallons of product needed to treat your particular area. So those are the two formulas. Let's go ahead and run through a couple examples of how these formulas work. Let's begin with a granular example. How much Ronstar 2G is required to treat a field measuring 800 feet by 210 feet at a rate of 3 pounds active ingredient per acre? Really, the first step is to determine your area. We take 800 feet, multiply it by 210 feet. We have an area of 168,000 square feet. The next step is to plug the information into the formula that I provided in the previous slide. So the first part of the formula shows you your rate, your desired rate, which is 3 pounds active ingredient per acre. The middle part of the formula is converting 168,000 square feet into acres. And then the part over here on the right of the formula is compensating for the fact that Ronstar 2G does not contain 100% active ingredient and only contains 2% active ingredient. So in order to put down the desired rate, we have to compensate for the fact that only 2% of Ronstar 2G contains active ingredient. If we work through the equation solving the parts that are in parentheses first, then essentially we're going to be multiplying three numbers together. We're going to be multiplying 3 times 3.85 times 50. And then your answer is 578 pounds of Ronstar 2G. So that is the amount of Ronstar 2G that would be required to treat a field measuring 800 feet by 210 feet at an effective rate of 3 pounds of active ingredient per acre. I hope that worked for you. Let's go ahead and take a look at a liquid example next. How much Princep 4L is required to treat an area measuring 800 feet by 210 feet at a rate of 2 pounds active ingredient per acre. The 4L in Princep 4L means you're talking about a liquid, and it contains 4 pounds of active ingredient per gallon. So in the gallon container of Princep, there's 4 pounds of active ingredient in 1 gallon. The area is the same area that we used in the previous problem. So we take 800 feet times 210 feet, we get 168,000 square feet. And then we can plug the information into the formula for liquids. So our desired rate is 2 pounds of active ingredient per acre. This part of the equation will be converting square feet into acres, and this part of the equation will be compensating for the fact that the Princep only contains 4 pounds of active ingredient per gallon. So it doesn't contain 100% active ingredient. If you solve the parts of the equation that are in parentheses first, then you have three numbers that you have to multiply. You have 2 times 3.85 times 0.25, giving you an answer of 1.9 gallons of Princep 4L. So 1.9 gallons is the amount of Princep 4L that you would need to apply to an area measuring 800 feet by 210 feet in order to get an effective rate of 2 pounds of active ingredient per acre. Phew! Well, I hope you got that. The formulas aren't too bad. They make it pretty easy, and of course they would be provided to you on any quiz or exam. It's not something you need to memorize. But I think you do need to understand what the different parts of the formulas do so that you can understand what your answer means when you calculate it. Okay, there's a lot of choices out there in terms of herbicides that you can select. Lots of different choices. A lot of herbicide information to sift through, and trying to find the right product for your application may seem like a daunting task. The following link will take you to an online resource that might help. In the full PowerPoint version, which I'll post in the lessons folder on Blackboard, there will be a link to this website called Controlling Weeds in Nursery and Landscape Plantings. And in that document, you will find information on different pre-emergence herbicides. That information you'll find on pages 26 through 50. And if you're interested in using post-emergence herbicides, that information will be found on pages 50 to 60. Also, if you want to use a site that's pretty good at describing different weeds, there's a site called the North Carolina Plant Toolbox that will help you identify weeds and also plants that are native to North Carolina and include most of the southern United States. One final thing to consider is something called herbicide resistance, which is nicely illustrated by the picture that you're looking at. So basically you're looking at two different clones of a weed called horseweed or male's tail. The clone on the left happens to be resistant to glyphosate, whereas the clone on the right is susceptible to the herbicide glyphosate. In red, you see 0x, 1x, 2x, and 4x. So 0x simply means that no herbicide was applied to those plants. 1x means that 1 times the recommended dose of herbicide was sprayed on those two plants. 2x means that 2 times the recommended dose was applied to those two plants. And 4x means that 4 times the recommended dose was applied to the two plants in the background of the slide. So if you look at these pictures, you can see that on the susceptible clone, applying the herbicide at the recommended rate, or twice the recommended rate, or 4 times the recommended rate, will definitely kill that particular clone of the species. On the left-hand side, you have a resistant clone, and it is not affected by the normal herbicide dose or even twice the normal herbicide dose, but you can see some effect at 4 times the recommended dose. If you're looking kind of in the background on the left-hand side, you can see that the plant is starting to have some kind of brown tips to the leaves, showing that it is suffering from some herbicide injury, but it certainly hasn't killed this particular clone. So this is a problem in our industry in that some of our weeds are becoming resistant to the herbicides that we apply to control them. There is a herbicide resistance action committee called HRAC, and they provide comprehensive information about weed resistance and best practices. This committee has identified over 250 herbicide-resistant weed species, and of course the number continues to grow. Some management techniques are key in preventing herbicide resistance. Number one, use mechanical weed control such as cultivation or hand weeding to control weeds whenever possible. Number two, and this is important, rotate herbicides. Do not make more than 2 consecutive applications of herbicides with the same mode of action in the same field or on the same group of container plants. And number three, use tank mixes of herbicides with differing effective modes of action. So these are ways that we can prevent herbicide resistance from developing in our weed populations. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for watching.